Hey everyone, it's Michael GoosebumpsFan, and today we're going to be talking about a Brian Keene book for the Things Like Goosebumps section of my channel. This book is called Darkness on the Edge of Town. One of my favorite book covers ever. I don't know what it is. It's just so cool looking. Brian Keene is an adult horror writer. This book is probably about 270 pages, I would say. I do not recommend this for folks that are younger. I don't, because it's kind of creepy. It genuinely gets to me. It is an adult horror book. It's not like a scholastically published middle grade type book. Brian Keene is some severe stuff, man. Brian Keene is one of those people from the horror genre that a lot of people know about, like Richard Lehman, that has a reputation for being scarier than most horror writers. I think Brian Keene's better than Stephen King. Not so much with characters, because Brian Keene doesn't put too much into his characters, at least from what I've seen. Mostly with The Rising and City of the Dead, which are a completely different series from this. But Darkness on the Edge of Town is my personal favorite book of his. I love it to death. I would love to see a film adaptation of it. It would be so good. We kind of got one with Vanishing on 27th Street, I think is what it's called. I think is the title of that book, or that movie. The reason I say this is kind of like a Goosebumps type thing is because it's more like a Twilight Zone type thing, which I also kind of contribute as being something I would like to talk on the channel at some point about that feels like Goosebumps. Which Goosebumps has more in common with Tales from the Dark Side than it does Twilight Zone, but it's all kind of the same thing, an anthology horror / science fiction series. Yeah, my channel is mostly focused on Goosebumps, but I think it's worth talking about this on here. I have a couple of things I want to talk about. Excuse me, I have indigestion. That's part of getting old. I want to talk about this in general because I think it's worthwhile. I'd like to recommend it to people, because again, on my channel we don't just have people who are young children. We have people who are my age, like 25 and so, that have grown up on horror, or who grew up on Goosebumps and now read adult horror and watch adult horror films and stuff. And I thought it'd be worthwhile talking about this because of how good this actually is. If you haven't read Brian Keene, you're missing out. It's a giant treat. Brian Keene really knows what he's doing. He writes everything from ghost stories to zombie stories to stuff like this. Now, for anybody who's familiar with Stephen King, as a matter of fact, you happen to know about a book probably called Under the Dome. It also had a TV show at one point. Darkness on the Edge of Town was actually accused of being a ripoff of that, and it's not, which Under the Dome was also considered to be a ripoff of the Simpsons movie, with the dome over the town in that movie as well. Essentially, in Darkness on the Edge of Town, a bunch of people wake up in a town in Virginia, which is weird because it's where I live. Makes it even more personable. And I read this back in high school when I read it for the first time, and I loved it then. I still love it now. It's not like the greatest thing I've ever read, but I still adore it a lot. I have so much of a nostalgia for it, even though I was a teenager when I read it. And it'll stick with me for the rest of my life. And I reread this book probably in like the spring of this year at some point, and I really loved it. It was so good to read this and just have such a fun time. It's creepy. There's an atmosphere to it that I haven't read in many other books at all. It's usually a Brian Keene type thing. I think he always does well with atmospheres. But anyway, this town, for some reason, is surrounded by darkness. And nobody knows why. It just is. We can't find out. Like, if anybody goes and drives out of the town in their car into the darkness, you'll start hearing screams and stuff over in the dark, like something happened to them. But the people don't ever come back. For whatever reason, we don't really know. And the book feels like a Lovecraft type thing. If you've read H.P. Lovecraft before, that very kind of just darkness, the fear of the unknown, that's here, and it works so well, and it's so great. I don't know why I didn't think to do a review for this on my channel before, but it deserves it, and Brian Keene deserves it. He deserves more attention, and I recommend the book heavily. I hope you guys will check it out. But the town, like I said, is surrounded in darkness. People start to look around, and they find out on the edge of streets and stuff, there's actually these markings, like these symbols on the ground, and apparently there's a homeless man named Des that might be behind this. Now, our main character in the book, this is the thing with Brian Keene, too, that I've noticed personally. He doesn't write the best characters, like I said. He's not really a character guy, he's more of a story guy. And I like stories more than I like characters. That's why I'm a big Goosebumps fan. I could care less about the characters and their history and their lifestyle and everything else compared to what happens with them and around them. If you're like that, too, if you love Goosebumps, you'll love Brian Keene. He writes exactly like that. And this book, essentially, a man lives with his girlfriend person, and he has a best friend named Russell, I believe, that lives in the same apartment complex building thing as he does. But this darkness, right, it starts affecting people. People start getting mean. A lot of horrible things start happening. All kinds of crime. Really, really brutal crime, too. You don't see a lot of it, per se, but you hear about a lot of it from different people. Just a lot of horrific things happen. And it gets pretty intense, man. That's one of the best things about this book. It's 260 or so pages. and it just builds and builds and builds into this really tense situation that you don't know what's going to happen next. And again, this darkness, for whatever reason, even though it can't make its way over the town because of whatever these symbols are on the ground, if you get too close to the darkness, you start seeing things. If you have a dead grandfather, for example, that you love to death and you'd love to see again, you might start seeing him in the darkness past the edge of town, and he might be calling out to you and telling you to come towards him and stuff. It's creepy. It is a creepy book. It's just a creepy idea in general. Again, it feels more like a Twilight Zone type thing. So if you're a big fan of that more than Goosebumps, you're probably going to love it. Brian Keene really has a lot to offer, in my opinion. One of the most talented writers that we have nowadays that no one talks about. He will be the H.P. Lovecraft of his time, more than likely. Even though he's got a bigger reputation already than H.P. Lovecraft did. But I dig this a lot. I really, really recommend it if you haven't checked it out before. Let's see, was there anything else I wanted to talk about with this book? I feel like there was something else I wanted to mention about this. But anyway, it's not really the point. If you haven't read Brian Keene's Darkness on the Edge of Town, again, I couldn't recommend it enough to you. Fantastic writer, fantastic book. Easily my favorite book that Brian Keene has written so far. He's fantastic. I just love his stuff. What did you guys think about Darkness on the Edge of Town? If you happen to have read it, I really, really recommend it. It's so good, especially for somebody like myself who grew up on Goosebumps and Twilight Zone and Tales from the Dark Side and Tales from the Crypt and all these things that I love and cherish. This is up my alley immediately, and I can tell you, if you're into those things too, this will be for you. You'll love it. If I had to rate Brian Keene's Darkness on the Edge of Town on a 5-star basis, I'd probably give this a 4 out of 5. It's fantastic. It is such a good read. One of the most engaging reads ever, in my opinion. I also love at one point, one thing I was going to mention too, it gets to the point where the atmosphere of this darkness over the town and whatever it's doing supernaturally to the people in the town, not so much possessing them, but just kind of forcing them mentally into this weird, kind of pushy way to start doing bad things like I talked about. Even our main character and his girlfriend that live in the same apartment decide to kind of split ways, and like she'll go in one room and keep to herself and he'll go in another room and keep to himself, just so they don't argue. Because if you start arguing, it opens up all these doors to hatred and you just want to kill each other. That's one of the biggest things about this book, is the bloodlust that comes from this situation. It gets really intense. Again, if you're a big fan of Under the Dome by Stephen King, you're going to find a lot of similarities here. I don't really care if it is a copy or not. It doesn't really matter to me because it's still great. I actually prefer it to Under the Dome as much as I love that book as well. Hopefully one day I can talk about that here on the channel if I get a chance to reread it at some point, God willing. But this is a great book. I have a lot of things to talk about that I wanted to talk about here on the channel, to just kind of recommend things like Goosebumps, because I saw so much recently. I've read so many books recently that I thought would be worthwhile talking about. But even so, what did you guys think about Darkness on the Edge of Town? If you have read it, again, 4 out of 5 stars for me. It's fantastic. I could not recommend it enough to you guys. Thank you for watching. May the Lord Jesus Christ bless you guys today, and goodbye.